we reach middle age, it's time to take stock of passion projects left behind. Chris Wilcha grapples with this theme in his documentary, Flipside. I'm Tom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. When Chris Wilcha was a teenager in the late 80s, he went to work at a New Jersey record store called Flipside. It was a place where fellow obsessives could talk for hours about their favorite music. In the ethos of the time, indie was good, corporate was bad. After college, Chris felt conflicted when he was offered a job inside the corporate beast of Columbia House, a company that sold top 40 CDs and tapes by mail. Chris took the job and brought his new video camera to work every day. He turned those experiences into a documentary called The Target Shoots First. It played in 2000 at the Slamdance Film Festival. You don't get any more indie than that. Chris then got a dream job directing the TV series This American Life, based on the beloved radio program. It lasted 2 seasons. The Hollywood director Judd Apatow invited Chris to Los Angeles to film behind the scenes of the movie Funny People with Adam Sandler. Chris seemed to be on a streak of good luck, but it ran out. When Chris tried to get other documentary projects going, they stalled. He started directing TV commercials to support his family. Years went by of directing commercials. Then Chris chose a new passion project. He'd make a documentary about Flipside Records, the store where he started as a teenager. Flipside was barely hanging on with the same owner, Dan. Chris wondered if he might save Flipside. The movie he eventually made is a personal essay that's partially about the record store, but it's also about reckoning with choices at middle age. Chris digs into his archive of unfinished projects. He weaves in old interviews that never saw the light of day. There's the jazz photographer Herman Leonard, who died before Chris could finish a film. There's the television writer David Milch, who got Alzheimer's. There's This American Life host Ira Glass, who pulled the plug on a film when his marriage broke up. And the eccentric comedian Uncle Floyd.
Flipside Records, Flipside, last shit. Take 2.
Okay, take 2.
Flipside Records, with records filled bin to bin. Flipside Records, from rock and roll to Beethoven.
I knew Chris over 15 years ago when he lived in New York, but we had scarcely kept up. Last summer, he sent me a rough cut of Flipside for my job picking documentaries at the Toronto International Film Festival. It hit close to home in many ways. The New York Times once used me as a case study for documentary filmmakers who left projects unfinished. I'll link to that in the show notes. And it wasn't only me who saw themselves in this story. When I picked Flipside for TIFF last year, it was the festival's best-reviewed documentary, from The Hollywood Reporter, The Wrap, IndieWire, and others. Now it's in theaters from Oscilloscope Laboratories, the company founded by the late Adam Yauch of the Beastie Boys. I spoke to Chris last week, the day his film was opening at New York's IFC Center. I started by asking how he originally came to direct This American Life.
I had read that This American Life was trying to develop a TV version of itself. There would be these little, mentions in different, filmmaker magazine or this or that. And I was always like, oh my God, that sounds like the gig of a lifetime. And total social fluke, I went to a friend's birthday party in upstate New York. And lo and behold, somebody introduces me to Alex Bloomberg, one of the producers of This American Life. And we get to talking, and he said that they were in the process of, they had been, interviewing with different directors. They'd been talking to a lot of different people. And we just had such a great conversation. And he was asking me questions like, well, how might you do this? And what would it look like if we recorded, would you put Ira in it? And I was just sort of brainstorming in real time. And we had such a good conversation that we followed up, the following week. And he basically brought me in to do an interview. And I, I saw this as an opportunity of a lifetime because I was just convinced that this was the documentary gig to end all documentary, directing jobs. So I did, I made, sort of a visual deck. I remember I had a stack of VHSs and DVDs because I wanted to almost like a DJ reference things so they could understand, like, this is what it would look like with the host on screen. It would look like if this was sort of more of a personal essay. And for whatever reason, the energy was good. And they basically, hired me to do the gig. Now the gig, the job, the expectation was simply to make what they now call a sizzle reel, a test tape, 10 minutes of footage with some accompanying, story to just do proof of concept to Showtime that this was a viable idea that they could greenlight. And I remember there was a very modest amount of money. I believe it was $10,000 that were set aside to do this. And, I couldn't help myself. And basically we got into the brainstorming. We started to figure out stories we wanted to do. Some of the stories required shooting a little bit now and a little bit more later. And we basically threw ourselves into it and started to make what ultimately became the entire pilot episode. And we were also experimenting with ideas. Like we did a whole thing that was an illustrated version of one of their audio pieces. So we shot, actors, playing out full reenacted scenes. We shot, a story of this bull. We returned to do additional follow-up shooting. And by the way, no new money was emerging. This was all, and again, stop me if this is too long a version of the story, but basically we created an entire pilot because I knew, and I think everyone knew, that if we didn't blow the Showtime executives away, that there was a possibility that this would all fall apart. So I was just so determined to hand something in that just made the decision inevitable that they would greenlight it. So it took about 5 or 6 months to sort of do all that. But sure enough, Showtime signed on and gave us a series order.
It seems obvious why this would be an appealing idea because This American Life was an incredible factory and remains an incredible factory for bringing in fascinating stories. But it also seems self-evident why this could be challenging to transfer the magic from this radio program into television. And I wonder how you experience the second part of that, the challenging part.
The prospect of translating the radio show into a TV show was utterly terrifying. And one thing that kept coming up was that they always knew the ending when they went into reporting something. They always knew sort of how things were going to turn out. And they could plot their stories in their audio editing to accomplish that goal, to create the path to arrive at that surprise or wonder or epiphany. And with filmmaking, we would often have to go and shoot something at some expense where we didn't know the ending. You know what I mean? There was something had to be documented, and you had to kind of commit some money to do that. Filmmaking, you sort of leave the house and you're spending $10,000 on, whatever, gear rentals and crew and location scouting and hotels. Whereas, the model of doing radio was so amazing to me, and from economically speaking, that a producer could go with a microphone and a recorder, could go capture a bunch of interviews, be editing on the plane ride home, and have something to sort of, assess within a couple weeks. And that was another mind-blowing thing for me, was that one of the ways that This American Life keeps very high quality control is that they can kill stories. They can make an entire story, report it out, compose it, put music in, and they can say, you know what? It's not good enough, or it's not satisfying, or there's not the surprise that we are known for. And they can kill it. And the thing about the filmmaking side of things was we could not do that with any regularity. So one of the things that we built into the shooting budget once we got the green light was the ability to kill a couple of things. And it was hard because, you trudge down to Texas to interview some prosecutor and, all the blood, sweat, and tears that takes and the crew and the time. But if it's not good enough or the story's not working, we're not going to air it. So that was a big deal. I think another thing that was part of the job that I don't know that I knew going in, but I quickly understood was that it was important for me to constantly situate everyone with what was happening, to never be like, don't worry, you're not part of the process, I'll do this. You know what I mean? I had to basically constantly say, here's a reference for what this might be, or, here's how here's what I'm going to shoot to accompany this, because it was a very different way of, they were so used to writing into their stories. They could summarize characters' entire perspectives with writing. And that gets exhausting in a visual medium, right? You can't just have 7 or 12 minutes of writing with one single sound up from a character. So there was some push and pull. And I think that, they got up to, these are smart people, they got up to speed very quickly, but they had just been so used to working a certain way. So I think there was a little bit of a learning curve.
Is there a favorite segment or show in the program that embodies what you thought it could be at its best?
I remember, so we did a season and it was really exciting, and I felt like we were just kind of had found by the end of that season like our stride. You know what I mean? Like there was some hits and misses, but I think by the end we were feeling confident. And in the second season, we did an episode called John Smith, and it was overseen by one of the producers, Lisa Pollack. And it was the story of a collection of men named John Smith from birth to death. Basically, we found a John Smith who was a child who'd just been born. We found a teenage John Smith. We found, a sort of young adult John Smith, all in different phases of their lives. And one of them worked for Microsoft and was having a totally thriving career in Seattle. One was a fry cook in Wyoming who was a little bit down on his luck. We found a John Smith in a nursing home who couldn't speak anymore, and his family had to speak for him. And it was the first time that I felt like we were truly taking advantage of the visual part of the storytelling, but we were also taking advantage of their expertise in, the absolute sort of epiphany generating, audio craftsmanship that they're known for. And that was a moment where I was like, this is really exciting. And can we please do more of this? And, for me, it was a little bit heartbreaking because that was around when they started to burn out on balancing just the pure labor of doing a TV show and a radio show at the same time. And that's when they sort of said, this was fun, but radio is our, favorite medium. And so we're gonna walk away. And it was the gig of a lifetime, Tom. I mean, because I was thinking about this earlier today. The thing you're looking for as a filmmaker is chances to do things. You need to generate leads and opportunities and new ideas and characters. And every week it was like a chance generating machine. And because it was an established brand, you could go out and do things and try things and shoot things and bring them back to the laboratory. And when I was back in my freelance life and I would take a run at something and it would fall apart, and this sort of leads into Flipside, I had no recourse. I you know what I mean? Like there wasn't the resources or the infrastructure or the existing outlet to just start plugging things into it. And so it was a very heady, exciting opportunity for a documentary filmmaker.
Every documentary film career, has highs and lows and, lucky breakthroughs and then long stretches of not being able to get together what you're trying to get together. And I think one of the things that draws me so strongly to Flipside is that it evokes an experience that a lot of us live through, but don't necessarily have an outlet to talk about. Can you describe what it meant when you came off this dream job and then tried to get the next thing going?
Yes. Well, there's an interesting timing thing, which is the momentum and interest in This American Life created some opportunities and some interest for commercial directing jobs. And so right after I finished This American Life, I had a nice little distracting period where I got some commercial gigs, and I was like, this is kind of interesting. Like this is a kind of work I didn't expect to be allowed to do or to be invited to this party. And boy, wouldn't it be interesting if I could balance the commercial directing with the documentary stuff? Because I was also realizing that for documentaries, the development period can be endless. You know, there can be very open-ended timelines. Like, it's not just like, okay, you know, this is a 6-week gig and you're in and you're out and here's, you know, the clearly defined paycheck. This was also before what we've now come to know as the golden age of documentary. You know, like, I think there was a lot more reality TV around, which felt a little bit like not quite the documentary utopia that I'd hoped it would be. So I started doing some commercial directing, and that actually was like, maybe I can actually make a living at this and balance these two things. And then the next opportunity this was kind of, you know, a thrilling sort of next step was we won a couple of Emmys, right? So that got us some attention. And lo and behold, I get a text message from Judd Apatow, who I didn't know. He reached out cold. And one of the things I've come to really appreciate about him is he is so comfortable being a fan of things. Like, he will just reach out to people and be like, loved your film, loved your book, you know? And so at that moment, he was developing and about to start casting for a movie he was making called Funny People. This was around 2008. And he said, hey, why don't you come document the process? And I didn't totally understand, you know, what it was going to be like or what the resources or the support for it would be. But I talked to my wife. We had these 2 young kids. We owned a place in Brooklyn. We thought that's where our life was going to be, but we decided to go have a big adventure in Los Angeles. So we sublet our place and we, you know, rented something in LA, and I went off to document, you know, the making of Judd's new movie. And by the way, quick sidebar, other things came up during the prep process to work with Judd, which is I started spending a lot of time with Gary Shandling. And he had been kind of one of the ghosts of Funny People. He was like a mentor of Judd's. And it's not totally based on him, but he's definitely, his spirit is in there as like a mentor of Judd who kind of lives up on the hill, you know what I mean? And is wealthy and established. I don't think he was quite as tragic a character as Adam Sandler, but, and I remember I started making these pilgrimages to Gary's house to go try to convince him to possibly be the subject of a documentary. First to maybe be in kind of the making of, but then I think Judd and I both thought, wow, Gary would be an amazing kind of companion piece to this. And he would indulge me. He would always want to meet up and talk for hours at a time. And he wrote me these absolutely exquisitely beautiful, like letters to a young poet style emails about stay strong and be creative and follow your heart. And, you know, they're amazing. Like, I look back at them now, but he would never commit to filming. Like, I would be like, okay, Gary, you're doing a set, you know, on Friday afternoon in San Diego. Can I just come and shoot? And he'd be like, yeah. And then he'd never tell me the address or what, you know what I mean? Like, he because I think he was at a moment in his career where he was actually uncomfortable with the quality of the material he was doing, where he was working things out, he was figuring things out, and he wasn't particularly interested in documenting it. So I shifted my attention to documenting the making of Judd's movie, but it was incredibly fascinating and meaningful for me to spend time with Gary Shandling. You know what I mean? Like, he was just he was so smart and so funny and so interesting and kind of also maybe a little tortured still, even though he was so, you know, such a comedy guru in LA.
I should insert here that Judd Apatow later made a film about Gary Shandling, and I talked to him about that on this podcast a few years ago. So that did finally, that circle was closed eventually.
And I should say the only person who should have made that movie was Judd Apatow, because he was Gary's son in some ways, you know, his comedy mentee, his son. And the only person who could have made that with the kind of depth and soul and intensity of what that film turned out to be was Judd himself. I shouldn't have done it, but it was for me to be involved in the prep of that was really fascinating. And in some ways, Tom, another unfinished film. You know, like, because I saw the possibility of it, but I didn't get the chance to make it, you know?
Yeah. Here you are in Hollywood. You're trying out new things. You're directing commercials. And I want to ask you about the theme of selling out, which, is core to your first film, The Target Shoots First. It's a theme of Flipside. It's something that seems to have been a big idea on your mind, and it makes sense. You came out of working in used record stores and, were in a punk rock band. That's not a theme of every generation, but it was definitely a theme of that generation who was coming of age in the late 80s, early 90s. I wanted to ask you, what did it mean to sell out to you? What was the embodiment of selling out, and what was the embodiment of resistance to selling out?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's such a quaint idea now when I look back at the preoccupations of my, 18 to 24-year-old self who was music obsessed, and, me and my friends smugly clocking, which bands were signing to major labels. And somehow, this was a transgression of the purity and integrity, of their artistic musical practice. And it was all kind of ridiculous because, of course, I also think back to some of these indie labels. Some of them were not exactly the picture of integrity, that these bands were signed to. But there was this perception that somehow, and, I remember the earliest iterations of this, even when I was working at Flipside and I was young. I remember hearing the story of the Del Fuegos, who had done a beer commercial right at around when they were, kind of hitting their stride. And apparently there was this intense backlash that is still part of their mythology, that it really worked against them, that they did this beer commercial, And I think that there was very simple black and white sort of ideas about, selling out and good and bad. And it was almost like a little bit of a sport. But then clocking who did and didn't sell out. But then as I was getting a little bit older and I, had to find a way to make a living in the world, my ideas about selling out had to evolve, right? Which is, okay, so I'm in a capitalist society and I have to make a living, but can I somehow balance the art and the commerce? Can I somehow do something that subsidizes something else? And the trick that I kind of pulled off with my first film, The Target Shoots First, which is I got a job in a very kind of, isolated, kind of uncool part of the music business, which was a mail order CD and tape club, a now totally obsolete idea. And I documented it for the couple of years that I was there. And what was great, and my kind of Gen X rationalization was, I was like, I'm here, but I'm kind of not here. I'm like a corporate spy. I'm documenting this absurdity, and someday I'm going to cut this together and make a film out of it, and I'll tell the story of this funny Gen X coming-of-age experience. And remarkably, I actually did that, and that was my first film that I ever made called The Target Shoots First. This selling out idea, though, kind of persisted in my brain. And what happened is as life got a little more complicated and layered and kids came into the picture and mortgages came into the picture, I was trying to figure out how to, again, keep some balance where you're maintaining some integrity, trying to carve out a space to do some kind of work that is meaningful and maybe untouched by, unsullied by, corporate concerns. And that was when I started to balance trying to do commercial directing work, which is the most absolutely pure form of selling out. But the thought is then I would do the most pure form of my own work, right? That I would somehow find the perfect balance, that these things would negate each other. And one big model for me, and at least maybe it was my own mythologizing of him, was that, Errol Morris somehow pulled this off, right? That he would subsidize the commercials. He would subsidize his films by directing commercials, and he would use the short ends or the camera equipment. now that I've gotten to know more about Errol's career and the fact that I sometimes compete against him in the commercial world, I now wonder, because he just, I think, loves to work and make things, and he'll do anything and he'll take any paycheck. Like, I just lost a job to him a week ago. And I'm thinking to myself, Errol, you don't need the money anymore. Like, please, let the rest of us, try to get our DGA healthcare in here. But anyway, so I feel like this is an incredibly long-winded way of saying that my ideas about selling out evolved. And of course, I came at a certain point in my, and one of the themes of Flipside is interrogating the idea of things you want to take with you and things you want to leave behind in midlife, right? So is that the stuff that is in my parents' house that I've been storing there for years, but it's also ideas that need to be reconsidered or revisited, like this whole notion of selling out and having this kind of inner critic on my shoulder all the time telling me, hey, do you really want to be doing that? Or, oh, gee, you've really compromised, your 16 or 20-year-old self here by taking on this, bank commercial. And so there was always that Gen X critic on my shoulder. And, in some ways it's useful. I think it keeps you aware and sometimes keeps you kind of interrogating the choices you're making. But I think in other cases, maybe it's not so helpful and it can just be paralyzing. It can just be a kind of, a toxic voice that, can get in your way, can obscure your path or obstruct your path, rather. It can sort of make you self-conscious about things that maybe you don't need to be.
Along the way, you tried different passion projects. In Flipside, we see a project about the jazz photographer Herman Leonard, something about Ira Glass when he was performing a live show, the writer Starlee Kine trying to fight through writer's block, and others. And you describe in Flipside that you'd work on one of these for sometimes months, and then for different reasons they would come to an end and they would become another hard drive on your shelf of an unfinished project. When did you get the idea that you could pull those hard drives off the shelf and weave them into this personal essay that became Flipside?
I think, if I'm being really honest with myself, I think it was kind of mid-pandemic. And I think we were all doing this, which is I was going through old stuff, right? I had some time on my hands unexpectedly. And all of a sudden I found myself organizing photo negatives, you know what I mean? And labeling things that hadn't been labeled in 20 years. And I would say, wait, what is on this tape, or what is on this hard drive that I just have dailies written on in the Brother P-Touch font or whatever, that I didn't even know what it was. And as I started sifting, I saw that there was a really significant archive of stuff had built up. Now, whether this stuff is interesting or meaningful to anyone else was still a question. But I would watch some of this footage and I would say, oh God, it's heartbreaking that this never saw the light of day. Like, I feel like there's some life to this material. And it's just a shame that this is, rotting on some hard drive that is going to have a data fail any day now and is going to be lost, forever. And I had also really wanted to follow through on the Flipside thing. I think it bothered me that I would go and I would make these pilgrimages to Flipside every year or so. I'd shoot for a few days, and that I never got momentum where I was assembling it in any meaningful way. But I also think I was acutely aware that that record store could not really sustain an entire film, right? Like, I didn't want to make some talking head documentary where people said, oh, it was great back in the day, and boy, it was fun working here. And I knew that I wanted to try to do something a little more complicated. So it was this mid-pandemic moment of assessing all this stuff. And there's a small group of people that I have worked with repeatedly. So a couple of producers, a woman named Alex Fish and Michelle Currender, this editor, Joe Beshenkovsky, and his producer, James Smith, and a friend of mine named Adam Goldman, who co-wrote it with me, and he also ended up composing the music for it. And, here we all were mid-pandemic, groping around for jobs and trying to develop things. And I sort of put this idea out that, hey, what if we focused our attention on maybe trying to develop Flipside. And by the way, everyone had other side hustles. There was no money for this. Nobody, was subsidizing it. But I think that this small group of people, after seeing some of the footage of like Uncle Floyd and some of the clips of things, were like, we think there's something here. And that was when that outside accountability, having those people get involved, and all of a sudden there being an edit that needed to be fed every day. It needed new footage. It needed new voiceover. It needed, hey, where's those photos of you as a teenager? All of a sudden, some momentum started to build, and we started experimenting with the structure. We started moving things around. We started seeing, well, hey, can all of these disparate things live in one place? Do these characters talk to each other? It was a sort of exhaustive editorial process. But it got made in the doing. It wasn't like a planned thing. We didn't script it, or, there wasn't a sort of detailed outline. I mean, don't get me wrong. There was, index cards on the wall and stuff like that. But it was in the doing and in the editing that the thing got figured out.
So it's such a delicate essay structure and very reminiscent of a This American Lifestyle, where your personal narration is helping to make connections between things that might be hard to make otherwise. What did it take to pull that all together? What was the hardest part about creating the structure to fit all these pieces?
I think there was a couple of things. I did work with an editor named Claire Ave-Lamont first. She was working with Joe Beshenkovsky, who ultimately sort of carried the edit to the finish line. And what Claire and I first had to do was just metabolize all of this stuff, right? So I inundated her and the editorial pipeline with the drives and the stuff and the archives. Like literally, I would give them over a whole stack of drives that would have just my entire collection of high eights that had been digitized. So we spent the better part of, 9 months or so, a year, honing things down, making highlight reels, starting to try structure and structuring it and assembling it. And then it was when Joe came on that the real trigonometry of the editing started to get figured out, where we really started, building these sort of documentaries within the documentary, then breaking them apart and seeing if they could be moved around into modular pieces, if a character's voice could recur. So you meet a person and then they pop up later at a thematically relevant moment. And that was, once that started to happen, once, for instance, like Herman Leonard, we saw that we could deploy him in 2 or 3 places throughout the documentary, and that he could actually carry some of the themes of the larger investigation. That was when real momentum started to happen, and it really started building itself. And then I think another thing that was surprisingly exhausting and time-consuming was the writing. So there was drafts, and I would constantly just feed stuff to the editors, and they would put things in, and I would just be, endlessly frustrated with why this wasn't working or why it just wasn't concise enough. And it was when I brought in this old friend of mine named Adam Goldman, who's a musician, but he's also a writer. And we would just sit in Google Docs and try, because voiceover writing, I think this, and I think your audience will also, this will resonate. It's not writing. It's like this weird aphoristic thing. It has to be sort of poetic. It has to be concise. You don't want to give everything away. You don't want gratuitous exposition that's stealing from what you're seeing. And I think it just took time to just constantly pare down, and just find, a hopefully simple but clear and sharp way for the storytelling to work, for the voiceover to carry some of these bigger ideas.
I often ask filmmakers what it means to have their film finished and bring it to an audience. But in your case, it feels extra significant because the film is really about being thwarted time and again, of being able to complete something and bring it to an audience. Can you describe what you were thinking about in bringing this to an audience and what it means to finally get it out there?
Well, I have to say, there was an open-endedness to the entire process because we had no outlet or deadline or place that this thing was going to exist. So there was this sort of possibility of slightly endless tweakery, which was a little deadly, right? That you can kind of stay in this zone of like, well, I should probably shoot more. Well, I should probably go get another soundbite from Dan. And, you know, and that started to creep in a little bit. And I have to say, a breakthrough moment for me personally and for the film and for all the people, you know, who were helping complete the film, was when we decided to apply to Toronto, to TIFF, to the Toronto Film Festival. And lo and behold, we got in. And again, I am going to thank you so profoundly much. You can cut this out if you want. But that was an absolutely breakthrough moment, both because of the profile of the festival, the sophistication of those audiences, and the privilege of being part of it. But it also provided a deadline, right? A really meaningful deadline. And so last summer, once we got word that we were in, so began the death sprint to get it done. So then all of a sudden there was no more like, coming up with 7 new ideas for things to shoot. We had to complete the film. So that deadline was incredibly meaningful, and we put our heads down and we got it done. And everyone was ready to kill me because I kept thinking of new things. Like a week before we finished, I found out that Dan was replacing the sign in front of the store. And I was like, we have to shoot that. We have to shoot that. You know what I mean? Like, you know, things just continued coming up that I found relevant to the storytelling. But that deadline of Toronto was so meaningful. And I remember I flew there. My parents came. I met them for dinner with my sister and my wife. And I was like, holy shit. An audience is now going to see this. Like, I had not considered that human beings were going to watch it. It was like this, we were obsessively focusing in our little bubble on trying to make the thing good. We were not thinking about any kind of reception. And it was at that moment that I felt a certain amount of terror, because it is a personal film, right? It's about my life. And again, I think I try to have a balance. It's not total navel gazing. I think that the goal was to try to have these other characters carry a lot of the big ideas, and that I'm kind of, part of a through line. But it was semi-terrifying, that first Toronto screening. And it was such an immense and profound relief when, not only was there a great audience reception, and I had some really incredibly thoughtful questions and a great conversation with you, but like some of the audience came up after and were talking about blocks they were having with their own projects and how did I get it done? And, there was something very emotional about the experience of showing it. And then something I didn't realize, this was just a naivete because I hadn't been in the festival circuit for a long time, the idea that these reviews that, have been pursued in the buildup to the festival, that they're embargoed until the moment the film screens. So we were walking out of our screening and we were going to go off and have, a kind of celebratory dinner. And these reviews start dropping in IndieWire and The Hollywood Reporter. And our minds were blown. I mean, they were positive, they were thoughtful. They were totally, nailing and connecting all the themes in a way that we, dreamed about. You know what I mean? And I can imagine now, someone has told me that they have had the experience of those reviews dropping and going to their celebratory dinner and it completely ruining everything and having the worst night of your life. You know what I mean? But we ended up having this incredibly dream-like festival experience where we left and we went to dinner and we were getting this kind of, this feedback that it was well received. And it was just very giddy and meaningful. Now, then began a more complicated process of trying to actually sell the documentary, because that was a little bit of, the bubbly, giddy illusion. But I have to say, that was a really breakthrough moment, was showing it in public for the first time.
There's a moment in Flipside where you describe holding 2 truths in your head. And, one truth is that in a creative life, you miss some opportunities, you make some sacrifices, there are roads not taken, and you can be mournful of those missed opportunities. And at the same time, there can be another truth, which is that some of the things that you made sacrifices for, creating a family, nurturing relationships, bring you a different kind of joy that pursuing creative projects don't necessarily bring you. And I wonder, how you came to articulate and become aware and find acceptance that's expressed in the film of holding these two truths.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just had no roadmap for this midlife moment. I didn't have a clear idea of a metric of how to measure things. And I felt so privileged and lucky, with the health and, of my family. But I also had this, it was tinged with a certain amount of heartbreak because there was projects that I'd been carrying around that didn't get made. And at the end of each year, this feeling would creep in like, I still didn't finish that thing, and I think I was just in this moment where I was trying to reconcile those two things, where I wanted to sort of try to say out loud. And in some ways, that state of balancing these contradictory things truly is adulthood. The idea that, again, you can love things about your life, but you can also experience great heartbreak about the things that you didn't do or the things, you didn't pull off. Another thing I was realizing is the previous decade had just been all forward momentum. There was no time to reflect about anything. I had young kids. I was chasing these freelance jobs. I was trying to make enough income to keep the trains running on time. It was just all forward momentum. And then I found myself where my kids were older and more independent, and some time was kind of coming back to me. And then I found myself looking at these hard drives and thinking, man, there's so much good stuff here. I feel like there is. But I was also, there's friends were starting to get mid-career retrospectives and, they were starting to get jobs that, they could look back on a body of work and sort of say, this is what I've been doing for the last 10 to 20 years, and it's all accumulated, and there's a story that this work tells. And I definitely wasn't feeling that way. You know what I mean? So I think that part of Flipside was trying to synthesize these two things. Can these ideas coexist both in your life, but also in the film itself? That you can express some of this disappointment and not ask for sympathy. It's describing it, but also try to remember and remind yourself of how profoundly lucky you are and what a great life you actually have.
I want to thank Chris Wilcha for speaking with me. His film Flipside is now playing in theaters. See our show notes for details. We recently launched a newsletter called Doc Voices, written by Anisha Javeri. You can subscribe on Substack. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Nordenswan, partnership manager Bella Racklin, and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphaela Nehausen. I'm Tom Powers. Follow us on Instagram and visit our website at purenonfiction.net.